Good morning and welcome to our Future Flex webinar. Today we're going to be focusing on what we can do to make the DSO services market more accessible to domestic flex providers. I'm Felicity Jones from Everose and I'm joined by Matt Watson from Western Power Distribution.
Hello.
And also Gary Swandels from SGC. Who's probably on mute, but is on the line. So, what have we got coming up this morning? So, Matt will be kicking us off with a brief overview, or indeed reminder for some, of what the Future Flex project is all about. And then I'll move on to what we've been busily doing in our workshops. But the main event for today is focused on summarising and synthesising those workshop outputs for you, what the barriers are, and then really to look at what your ideas were for creative solutions to address those, because ultimately what we're searching for here is the red balloon that helps us think outside the goldfish bowl. Then we'll have a brief aside on what I personally learned through the workshop process before rounding up with opportunity for you to ask questions, offer up feedback. And I would urge you to send through to us your questions and comments as we go. We will pick them up at the end. And with that, I shall pass over to Matt, who will talk us through briefly what Future Flex is all about. Matt.
Great. So thanks, Liz, for that. So yes, first I wanted to thank those who actually attended the workshops in person. You did better than I did. I was slightly waylaid with paternity leave, but thanks again, Liz, for kind of keeping that going and making sure it went as smoothly as possible. So my job is basically to kind of introduce the project and why we're doing it, and then Fliss is going to kind of go through the details of what we've learned. And the real kind of bit from WPD side of things is, we are, hopefully you're all aware that we're procuring flexibility services. So all DNOs committed to the assessment of flexibility services against sort of significant reinforcement schemes. And within WPD, we're doing that through our flexible power work, where we effectively look to procure demand, turn down, or generation turn up services in a range of zones. I think the real kind of key take was, this started off as a trial a number of years ago, and has now kind of moved across into the main business as sort of part of business as usual. There's a real commitment to this procurement. So I was involved in the startup, and now I'm delighted to say that I'm no longer involved because it's not considered innovation anymore in terms of sort of standard procurement. And the general theme is, that we are pushing more and more out to tender. There are, I think we currently have 123 megawatts in contract, and we launch new zones on requirements every 6 months. So we currently have a procurement out at the moment for 334 megawatts across 42 constraint zones. So if you are interested in those, please do follow up with the Flexible Power team directly. We want more megawatts and megawatt hours in those processes. I think the general view from quite a few of these procurements is that we need more participant volumes and more liquidity in these markets. So we acknowledge that we're still very kind of early days in this. We're still learning what we're doing. We're improving as we're going along, but there is really a kind of need to increase volumes. And so part of my remit within WP is to try and look at how we do that. How do we kind of make sure there are no undue barriers in our processes, and how do we kind of look at new ways of providing flexibility? And that's where Future Flex comes in. So we've got a range of projects looking at different aspects of this, but Future Flex has really kind of picked one specific element and is kind of looking into that. And the bit there is that kind of our original procurement through flexible power was primarily focused on larger users. So this was kind of not done specifically to exclude smaller participants. It was just kind of seen as the place to start, where it was kind of easier to. So the slightly more mature market was easier to return value to both parties and get things going. And what Future Flex is all about is then trying to go, well, actually, if we want to see this at scale, we want to increase, and then in future we see massive potential on the domestic side of things. So how can we develop services and that can then facilitate that and make sure that sort of the route to market is as simple and easy as possible. So within the project, we're supported by Everose, who are kind of doing a lot of the design, and then an SGC are kind of coming along as subject matter experts and kind of doing some of the project management. The project is in a number of phases, and we're basically coming towards the end of the really important bit right at the start, which is basically trying to get your involvement. So we took a kind of view early on, we needed this to be participant-led, so rather than me coming up with a list of things that we can do to improve services for participants, we thought we should actually ask you and try and get you guys involved in the design as much as possible. And so this is what this webinar is about trying to kind of get feedback from the workshops and kind of share that with you. And then we'll kind of move into actually building and trialing once we've kind of finalised what we're actually doing.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. So let's briefly recap what we've done with these workshops before then talking through what some of the outputs were. So we've had 2 sessions, one in Bristol, one in London a couple of weeks ago. And what we're really trying to do is refine ideas in response to your feedback. So we've had our 2 workshops. Today we're having a webinar and we're eager to get your feedback at the end of that. We're also having interviews and gathering ad hoc feedback, and thanks to everybody who sent me through such great input so far via email after the workshops. And then we will be publishing, based on all this engagement, a recommendations paper, and also providing all of the workshop data in an appendix in a form that's available to everybody so that you can review that and look yourselves. We will be engaging with people who are interested in actually participating in the trial to co-create the final kind of plan, and then we will have a clear decision on what exactly we're trialing and how we're going to be approaching that. So we're really trying to engage people as we go and take a co-creation approach. The goal of the workshops was twofold. Firstly, to look at what are the primary barriers to domestic flex supporting the DSO. And secondly, what creative solutions should we be trialling? And when we talk about barriers, we've primarily focused on the relationship between the DSO and the supplier or aggregator intermediary, the flex provider, as it were. We recognise that the role of individual households and individual consumers matters too, but we've been mostly focused on the relationship between the DSO and the intermediary. And we've really been, because this is an innovation project, focused on looking for step change innovations, not just tweaks to business as usual. And we're looking for something that we can trial over the next couple of years with at least 2 flex providers. I just wanted to flash up some of the organisations that were involved with the workshop, so you get a sense of who is participating and where this data is coming from. So we've got a mix of people right from kind of really innovative energy suppliers and aggregators. We've also got people coming from really kind of forward-looking kind of housing perspective as well, and lots of supporting advisors within the market and some of the supporting supply chain as well. So some great participation there. And so let's look at the barriers that people came up with. And I'll also talk through a couple of principles that I think should underline our approach going forward based on the workshop feedback. So in the workshops, there was a lot of post-it note activity, in fact, an extreme amount of post-it note activity. We had 369, we had lots of flip chart papers, we had lots of facilitator notes, and this is what we're trying to present to you today. And what we've done is gone through a process of digitising that and then synthesising it, because there's so much data there, really trying to draw out the core themes that are repeatedly coming up. And then just starting to touch it and analysing this, whilst doing that in a way that hopefully is not bringing too much of a bias to the process, and really trying to take this philosophy of being user-led. So when we look at these barriers, this chart shows how the barriers are categorised based on the DSO services life cycle. So on the left-hand side there, you can see that process right from advertising and qualifying and procure through to later, dispatching, measurement, assessment and payment. And we were asking participants to try to structure the barriers for domestic flex in each of those stages of the DSO services life cycle. You can see that in total there were 282 post-its or comments there. And, immediately it kind of jumps out that there are challenges here across the life cycle. We distilled that down into 37 or so discrete barrier topics when we were going through the clustering process. And it's worth also flagging that some of these topics and themes that came up kind of didn't fit into that life cycle approach. So there is a quite sizable other category there as well, because there are slightly more systemic barriers. But there are kind of three categories that jump out there as being problem areas or pain points for domestic flex providers. So firstly, under advertise. So what I'm putting up here is firstly the Everose summary of what the barrier is based on all of the post-it notes, which are shown in square brackets. Then I've also got a participant quote, which is taken directly from participants, which kind of helps to bring that barrier to life. So you can see the number one here is around value to customers is too low and also too uncertain. So there's a question around the materiality of the pound sign that's associated there, with the consumer asking what value is there for me. And then there are a couple of other barriers which initially we grouped together, but then we thought actually no, they are distinct. So one is around engagement and trust. Trust was a word that came up a lot. That consumer engagement and trust being low, and how do we buy in people into this process? And then related yet distinct is the awareness and the understanding of domestic flex in particular being quite low. So how do we deal with this residential understanding of flex concepts? And then under measurement, so this is another key kind of pain point. So there's partly a whole set of comments around baselining methodologies. Somebody saying here, baselining is so central to cracking this nut. And that's important when we're looking at contracting services, because we have to get comfortable that we understand what action is additional. And this is really why we need a clear baseline. So that was an area of concern. And I suppose related to that, multiple data challenges around accuracy, granularity, and availability, and just being clear on what exactly is needed. And then a final real crunch point area is almost like the catch-all here. And there were some quite philosophical comments here, actually. So the first one is quite philosophical, but I think quite poignant. So the value in the market is dispersed. It's not clear who is taking the lead in coordinating it with people asking for an integrated approach. There were concerns that I think are kind of well known around data control, privacy, and cybersecurity. Some people were saying they were actual concerns, some were saying they were perceived, but regardless, this is an area that people need to get comfortable with. And then there were comments around regulation, and in general, there wasn't so much specificity around those recommendations or the specific issues that were causing regulatory issues. It was more around the complexity and the fact that this is changing and it's quite difficult to manage. So one participant has said here, uncertainty in rules over time. So I talked briefly about value at the start of this slide. I did want to dwell on that a bit more because although some people have categorised that under advertise, if you look across all of the DSO services lifecycle topics, there were lots of comments on this. It was really cross-cutting. It's at least 33. It's probably more based on how you kind of categorise some of these comments. And it was a very strong message coming out in the qualitative discussion around participants feeling that the value available in providing flex services is insufficient. But there was some nuances around that as well. So some people concerned around the uncertainty and perhaps not having a sufficiently long-term time horizon on that pound sign, particularly in light of the fact that they might be putting in assets that have got a 10+ year lifespan. There was concern around externalities, so things like some of the social or the environmental benefits of domestic flex not being fairly priced or rewarded in the market. There was a concern that the value is priced based on short-term factors, so based on a current assessment of how this can help today, rather than taking a longer-term systemic view on how, if we support a domestic flex market now, that can reap dividends in the future by pump priming the market, by developing a supply chain, by bringing down costs, that there are kind of bigger, longer term benefits on offer here that aren't currently rewarded in the market. There's a kind of temporal myopia. And finally, issues around the stackability of services as well, and how that works together. And all of those post-it notes there are written by participants in the workshop. Another theme that came across, slightly more philosophical, is one around walking in others' shoes. So here are some participant quotes here. So people raising the question around mindset and consumer-led business models. People challenging us to start at the customer end and perhaps work towards DNO need, rather than doing what we did in the workshop, which was kind of looking at the DSO services lifecycle and asking people to map barriers against that. People looking at the language of how we frame this, calling it flexible places, not constraint zones, or asking the question, what if we start where flex assets are rather than where DSO constraints are? And I put this picture up because I think it is ultimately about mindset and being aware of possible implicit biases. And being aware that perhaps from a DSO perspective, the customer is everyone who receives an electricity bill, whether that's businesses, whether it's households, and really wanting to make sure that those flex services are procured in as cost-effective way as possible. But what participants were asking was also to think about the wider stakeholders here. So adopting that empathetic lens of what it's like to be a flex provider, and perhaps ultimately to take the view of households as well, and to think about being aware of the wider place-based context too. So that was a kind of theme around walking in others' shoes. Another theme was around being aware, and it came up repeatedly at both of the workshops, that the DSO is just part of the jigsaw puzzle here. So there were comments such as, please for an integrated approach. Somebody saying that the system is difficult because there are different veins of purpose and boundary, and that makes it difficult to navigate as a flex provider. There are issues around stackability. There were repeated comments around there being too many platforms as well. And so the challenge is how do we kind of join up these different jigsaw puzzle pieces, and realizing that the DSO is just one actor here and yet needs to be working in synchrony with others. Which leads to two suggested principles for a trial. Firstly, walking in others' shoes. I think we need to be clear who those shoes are when we're talking about the customer journey. Perhaps that is the flex provider, the aggregator or intermediary, but that needs to be absolutely front of mind as we proceed to the trial, and also thinking about how we join up that jigsaw puzzle. And there was, for me, an interesting question that was being teased by some of the participants around quite how assertive or proactive the DSO should be in this context. So is it that the DSO is a jigsaw puzzle piece, or is it that they should also be the hand that helps put those pieces together? How assertive should the DSO be in bringing actors together? And I think the consensus was that there's a view that that there's a slightly more proactive contributory role to play, but it's not for the DSO's sole responsibility to address this. So those were some of the kind of two deeper reflections coming out of the barriers analysis, which lays the groundwork for thinking about the trial. So on to creative solutions. I'd like to preface this section by clarifying that what I'm going to present is some of the workshop data, so it's a snapshot of the workshop data to give you a flavour of some of the ideas presented. We're not at this stage committing to trialling all of these yet. What we're going to be doing is reviewing them systematically against criteria over the next couple of weeks, and also based on the feedback from this webinar to decide which ones to take forward. So some of the ideas that came up. What if we trialled place-based value stacking? So often when we talk about value stacking in the power sector, we're really thinking about electricity. So for instance, we might think about DSO services, ESO services, perhaps a capacity market or energy market kind of value. The challenge or the idea that participants were coming up with here was around taking a more holistic view of value stacking that also incorporates and prices in some of the social and environmental benefits. So, for instance, top-ups to DSO payments, which might come from local authorities or from other actors who already have initiatives on fuel poverty or climate emergency initiatives, and they've got a willingness to engage, but perhaps there's a role for the DSO to help take a more holistic view here. And it's really acknowledging that unlike other flex assets, domestic flex, it's involving people, it's in the home, and therefore there's a range of other local social benefits that can be accessed here. So what if we trialled a way where we unlock wider value stacking beyond just slightly more technical electricity sector forms of value stacking? And the barriers that would be addressed here would primarily be about value. That was how participants were kind of framing it, as a solution to value. But in the discussion, it really became clear that actually this might help also to address issues of consumer engagement as well, if we lock into some of these other benefits and make them more explicit. What if we tried multiple variants of baseline? So some people well into the detail of how we address some of these baselining challenges, and proposing firstly a kind of desk-based review of methodologies out there, and then an actual trial of how you could of how they work, and ultimately trying to reach some kind of conclusion or consensus on that trade-off between accuracy but also having a pragmatic and cost-effective approach as well. So that was an interesting area of discussion. I'll save you the details beyond that, but that will all be available online in a couple of weeks' time. And then I suppose linked a little bit to the point around value stacking, one subgroup came up with, what if we trialled premium payments for low carbon flex, which would include domestic flex. So really this is about finding ways to give preferential treatment for low carbon solutions, such as domestic flex, during the procurement process. And there's a few different ways that this could be done. So perhaps a couple of participants suggested it could be linked to the DSO's own decarbonisation commitments. We're fairly early days in terms of framing the DSO business plans for Rio ED2, but perhaps it might be linked into the wider DSO net zero journey. Or perhaps it's something that could be priced through enabling consumers to elect for this. So I'm sure many people on the line already have green energy supply tariffs at home. What if we gave people, consumers, a choice to select a green flex billing option and perhaps pay a slight premium for that to get comfortable that their flexibility needs were also being met in a similarly environmental fashion. Or it could be some kind of rebooted eco, the energy company obligation, taking some kind of wrapped view with energy efficiency, though perhaps that's a bit needs a bit of thinking of how that would link with the DSO. But the core idea is, how do we help domestic flex benefit from being low carbon, and really trying to address value and consumer engagement in the process. A couple of other ideas. So we had lots of market enthusiasts in London really go to town with some of the market considerations. What if we trialled more modular flex products with secondary trading? So specifically what people were asking for were multiple procurement horizons. Slightly mirrored perhaps to some extent with what we see in the wholesale market, right from long term through to close to real time. What if we have multiple products with modular delivery durations that could be stacked together? So for those of you who are also active in DS3 on the island of Ireland, there's a parallel there with the FFR Porsaw Tor kind of product definitions there, and the way that they can be stacked and have quite granular delivery durations. And that's something that can potentially be particularly of interest to domestic flex, where perhaps it's more difficult sometimes, say if you've got electrified heating or some solutions to sustain that response over a long period of time. So that modularity could have extra value for domestic flex. There were some who were kind of really thinking to the future, thinking about how we could enable secondary trading to enable more efficient market operation and to use standard contract terms to enable that. And there was a desire to take a common approach across the DSO and the ESO. And perhaps that's partly in response to the concern around value being insufficient. If the value is considered low, then one way to get comfortable with that is to try and at least standardise the process for participation, so you're reducing your cost base there. And one participant in the ESO residential response project was suggesting that perhaps we could work together on that. The residential response project is looking at how domestic providers can access the FFR market more straightforwardly. So there were lots of thoughts around how we can perhaps refine the market environment for DSO services. And then there were suggestions, standardization for communications, for control and metering. And again, a plea for a common framework with the DSO and ESO, and looking to provide a definitive and forward-looking view on device requirements and making that accessible to a broad range of actors. So, for instance, if you're a housing developer and you're trying to make decisions with long-term repercussions on what on how to future-proof your housing for the provision of DSO services in future and perhaps other flex services, how do you know what you need to be doing to be ready and future-proofed? At the moment, it's not fully clear, and there's also different requirements across different services. So a request for standardization. So what we'll be doing going forward, we'll be assessing these options further, down selecting them and refining them. And to get a flavour for how some of these ideas are kind of being broken down. So this was one of the workshop outputs. So this is an example deep dive into a barrier, which was the achievability of DSO data requirements for domestic aggregation. So you can see that we looked at the criteria, the ideal solutions and roadblocks. And if we focus in about thoughts for trials, so this particular group was looking at really a twofold approach. So having a trial to demonstrate the adequacy of aggregated data sets, looking at how we can test having a portfolio of domestic DSO assets with extra high quality metering installed with local data recording alongside a lower cost basic metering solution, and seeing how the data sets compare and how aggregation might help improve accuracy overall. And we've got that portfolio view, even if individually there are data issues on a particular site level. So looking at the benefits of taking an aggregated approach and really driving into what data is required to gain comfort, and possibly also, secondarily here, investigating how we could supplement that data with other data from other sources, such as OLEV electric vehicle data. So that's another example of an idea. So that gives you an overview of some of the barriers, of some of the ideas that market participants are coming up with. I did just want to have a brief aside here on the process, and I put why it's really important to wear deodorant. So I'll be honest, these workshops made me sweat. It's quite hard work to structure a day which is genuinely seeking to be participant led, and where the content of the afternoon is entirely dependent on the user input in the morning. I'll just quickly cover that up. It's hard work because it's not us who's in control, it's you, it's the participants who are in control. But I wanted to reflect on that because I think it was actually one of the most successful aspects of the day, and it's something to think about as we approach future innovation projects. So one participant here said at the bottom, you started to push against the linear R&D approach to network innovation, promoting a more open, agile approach. And after all, it's this kind of agile philosophy and co-creation, which is already standard in some other parts of industry. Perhaps it's something to think through further in future network innovation projects about how we frame and involve people as we go. There are some considerations here and some lessons learned. So firstly, around diversity, we did have some feedback that around gender balance. I think we need to be always aware of biases in framing, and perhaps the way that we frame things around the GSO services lifecycle. It had a rationale, but also it's fair to challenge whether we could adopt a customer journey approach instead. And also it's challenging to facilitate when you don't know quite where the conversation is going. But it strikes me that there's lessons here around process, not just around content. And so I'm over to you, really. So let's move on to Q&A and wider opportunities to feedback. And just while you're sending through your questions, a couple of things first. So firstly, to summarise next steps and how you can get involved and stay on track. So if you have feedback or you'd like to express interest in being involved in the trial, you can respond on chat, you can catch us on LinkedIn, you can send me an email directly. And if you want to be tracking progress, this is a NIA funded project. All the outputs are fully available. We will be uploading all the workshop data the first week of March. We will be, and within a month of that, we'll be making decisions after discussions with yourselves on which ideas we will be trialing, and we'll be having regular updates on LinkedIn, and all of the outputs are uploaded to the Western Power website. I've put the web link there. And whilst we're just waiting for questions to come in, I wanted to hand over to you, Matt, on whether you have any initial responses from a Western Power perspective.
Yes. So as I said, please do use the kind of inbuilt question facility to kind of get some questions in. There's a few there, but this really is an opportunity for kind of questions on kind of feedback on where we're going. I think in terms of where I sit, I think it's an interesting way of being away from a project and some of the key stages from some of the workshops. But it was really nice to kind of come back and kind of see the level of input and the kind of sort of the level of kind of feedback and positive views around the process in which we're doing. So actually genuinely going out and talking to people about what could be useful. I think that's very positive. I think we've got a lot to do over the next few weeks to try and go through this in detail and try and really understand what we do next. So how do we assess these options? What do we take forward in terms of kind of that kind of provides value to have the potential to provide value to the end customer, and hopefully we'll be really trying to kind of spend time on this to make sure we don't that we really give each idea the kind of the time it needs. I think the kind of difference in perspective is something that's particularly interesting. I think there's a few kind of people in some of those workshops who we don't always engage with that often, and so actually trying to get some new perspectives in terms of kind of what's important and what works is really useful for us too. The final bit around this is just with all this, we just need to be aware that we are whatever we do in this space, it's always quite a bit of a balance to be struck. And there's a few comments where, and I think it's really, and I think this is what we're going to be thinking about over the next few weeks, about balances between different things. So, there's a few kind of people who are kind of really pushing for very much more of an interventionist DNO, kind of using our sort of unique position and scale within the industry to kind of really push forward and get things done. And I can really see some real positives on that. But then we've also got to balance that without, in terms of our requirements to facilitate competitive markets, not overreaching, not stifling competition, and also not getting into the world of policy setting. We need to leave that to sort of democratic processes. So there's some really kind of interesting balances we need to kind of strike within that, and we'll be really trying to think hard about kind of where we sit on that. Equally, other things around, the number of platforms, are there too many versus, how do we trial a number of things to kind of really push things forward. And I think that's really the exciting bit that's going forward, is kind of how we trial these things going forward. So, do we have any questions?
Yeah, so we've got one question here from Stuart Lloyd Evans around, do you expect this to increase or reduce customer prices overall? So Gary, I'll hand over to you first, and then Matt, perhaps you might want to elaborate on that.
I mean, really the underpinning principle behind everything we're doing here is about the customer, and it's probably a good time to reiterate that the nomenclature that we use when we're talking about flexibility can sometimes be a little confused. The difference between the customer and the flexibility services provider. The customer is, and Felicity, you did allude to this in your presentation. The customer is effectively everyone and anyone who's connected to the network and pays an electricity bill. And really, the majority of the initiatives that we have going here are all about driving those costs down. So there is a bit of a challenge there and a compromise that for flexibility service providers, clearly, in order to participate, they're looking for significant value in order to join such programs. But the whole purpose of those programs is intended to reduce the costs to the customer. And in fact, that is one of the things which is as well intentioned as it is, can cause some of the issues, because the DNOs already have a cost profile based upon doing reinforcement, and really the whole principle of finding these alternative methods is to drive down costs. Yes, with the added benefit of reducing carbon and the likes as well, but ultimately the primary underlying goal is to reduce costs to customers.
Yeah, and I think I would just echo most of that. Our primary objective is to fulfill our kind of view to kind of run economic and efficient networks for current and future customers, and it's very much about how do we manage our network as efficiently as possible. We don't do flexibility for flexibility's sake. We do it when we can provide best value to our wider customer.
Perfect. So keep questions or indeed comments coming in. If you've got a point of view, you can put that out there as a challenge as well. So we've got another question here around, have WPD identified any new technologies or initiatives that are entirely new through this engagement process?
So I think, I need to be honest in terms of how much of the detail that I've actually been able to read. So Fliss has been, since the workshop's been pulling together all the detail together, and we've sort of finally got it on Friday last week. So I haven't been able to go through the details and everything. So there may be some things specific. I think at a high level, there's probably nothing that's completely new, but I kind of take that as a positive in the fact that we're not being blindsided by anything. We're generally aware of what people are interested in. I think there's some interesting challenges and pushbacks on maybe bits that where we'd kind of had specific views or some different perspectives and some kind of different priorities and things. But I think there's nothing that came back as fundamentally surprising and stuff that I had genuinely never considered. But again, I think that's probably quite a useful thing and shows that we're not a million miles away from things. But, again, there may be some specific things within the detail that come out as we kind of look through this in more detail.
Gary, was there anything that surprised you?
I suppose there was. they really coming from the view that we were very inclined to look at it from a network topology aspect and how people are connected. And really, it wasn't so much from a technology or even indeed any specific proposal. It was more about being asked. Again, you've kind of alluded to earlier on the walking in other participants' shoes, and I think what we had have been very. I wouldn't necessarily say critical about this, but we have taken our own perspective and then probably not challenged ourselves with looking at things from a flexibility service provider's view at a domestic level, where really what they're trying to flip it around and try and identify the flexibility first, and then I'm not sure how that will work, but that's certainly a challenging view upon us to actually look at where the flexibility is and then how that can interact, rather than we tend to approach things at the moment from a problem basis. I think the most compelling and interesting one in that respect was I can't remember the organisation itself, but the housing association, and they have a continuous process of upgrading properties. And what would happen under normal circumstances is we may approach them for flexibility, and in the previous couple of years they may have gone about doing all their upgrades to the equipment, etc. And if they had an expectation, or indeed if there had been standards in place, they could have been in a position of readiness to offer flexibility. And probably the most significant thing is I didn't realise there was already an appetite, potentially within relatively small groups though, but there's potentially an appetite to be making those investments just now, because when they make their investments in these properties, it's typically 10, 15, 20-year life cycles they're looking for around any technology or improvements to the fabric and fixture of properties. So yeah, trying to broaden how we engage and the conversations we have, and yeah, certainly around standards, having the ability to have people in a greater state of readiness and coordinate with their investment profiles is probably the most significant thing that personally I hadn't given consideration.
Okay, thank you. A question here from Rich Furness, really probing the question around consumer understanding. Do domestic customers understand what their home is rapidly going to look like energy-wise, and the potential advantages of taking advantage of pricing that may vary with supply and demand, plus offering flex services? So it's really a question around customer awareness at the domestic level, probing that barrier. Matt,
yeah.
Would you like to?
Yeah, so I think we need to acknowledge that we're very early days in domestic flexibility. So, this trial is about kind of how we frame services and make it kind of as accessible for domestic services. And we acknowledge that this is not a mature market yet. So I think the starting position is, do all domestic customers know what that's going to look like? I think the answer is no. But there's a number of things that, that are happening through an industry that are trying to push that. So obviously the Future Flex is around kind of how we access that flexibility. We've got another trial called Made, where we're kind of trialing homes with multiple low carbon technologies and seeing kind of what flexibility can be accessed to. And again, that's, a small 5-home pilot that's starting to kind of uncover some of these things. I think they're starting again. I think the other bit that's really important on this is to kind of really understand how much of that is kind of not within the DNO remit, and kind of how much is that with supply. So a lot of that customer relationship and kind of that engagement, we very much see as kind of sitting with suppliers, and I think there's definitely some maturity, that there's some really interesting innovation going on in that space at the moment, and there's quite a lot of work to be kind of pushed through there to try and kind of help customers understand this, because I think from a technical level, things are maturing, and I think there's slightly, we did trials a number of years ago on domestic flexibility, and the conclusions were it was just really difficult. The technology wasn't there, engagement with customers wasn't there, there wasn't the automation. I think the sort of technological barriers are probably falling, especially with the future rise of EVs and home storage. I think the kind of challenges on how you get customers to buy into that and own that is a challenge. And I think, again, that comes back to some of these questions that have been raised around kind of what is our role in that, and what is the kind of role of the person who owns the customer relationship. So does that really need to be driven by suppliers? Do the DNOs need to take a more active role in that? If we do, does that cause confusion? Domestic customers really even know who we are? So there's some really interesting questions there, and I think we'll take that as a kind of try and understand what our role in a bit more depth kind of as we go forward.
Yeah, Gary, did you have any reflections on the role of the DSO there in helping with that understanding piece with domestic customers based on the workshops that you attended?
Well, I think I have to confess that with SJC we've been right at the heart of flexibility development with the DNO stroke DSO for a few years, and that has been fully concentrated around I&C. But even within that I&C environment, although more mature, I still very much regard it as being at the early stage of its life cycle, and it can sometimes still feel like there's a level of evangelism necessary and in fact ongoing to explain what's there. So understandably, at the domestic level, with it just kicking off, it's several steps behind that. And it's a more disparate type audience as well. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do. I suppose the question for me to some extent lies in whether the responsibility for that sits with the DSO or whether it's through intermediaries such as aggregators and suppliers. In as much as that everyone who's attending here today will be fully aware of what a DNO's role is and probably what a DSO's role is. The first stage we have of education we have to do at a domestic level is the fact that the local network outside your door is owned by a DNO and potentially optimized by a DSO, and it isn't actually national grid that comes right up to your doorstep. So no, I think we're right at the very beginning of that process, and we would be in single-digit percentages, I suspect, in terms of customers at domestic and potentially even SME level that understands the narrative.
Great. Okay, and then we have another question, which I think I'll take here, which is from Oliver Archer. On the green flex billing for consumers option to create value, can we really expect a discrete number of super green consumers to fund the DSR income for other consumers? Is this fair, or have I misunderstood the proposal? So I was leading the subgroup that was exploring this topic, so I'll take that on. Is it fair? Can we expect it to happen? I don't think we know unless it's trialled whether we can expect it to happen. I think there's some non-trivial issues around billing and how that would work. I think the bigger points that people were trying to make, that the participants were trying to make, is that there is a problem that low carbon is not currently well reflected or as a benefit within the market, and so people are trying to think creatively about who might pay for that and what the mechanism might be, and there were lots of exploratory ideas. We haven't yet scrutinized those in detail, but clearly there is some kind of analogy there with what happens in the energy supply market. I think perhaps now is a good time to wrap up. It seems that we've got through a few questions. So in terms of wrap up and next steps, just to really encourage you, if one of those topics and trial ideas that we raised earlier kind of caught your attention and you thought they were kind of juicy, then please do get in touch and express your interest to engage in a trial. We will be scoping up the trial ideas over the next 6 weeks or so now is the time to influence that and get involved. But otherwise, I'd like to really thank you very much for your fantastic input throughout this project so far. Watch this space in future. We really want to try and work with you to create something that helps enable the domestic flex sector to scale up and have real impact in the provision of local services. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.